feel like I'm not used to this setup. I feel like I really want to take this mic and just be like, come on. Yeah, hey, so hi, you guys. I obviously don't have the time. If you're familiar with the work I've been doing these last 4 years now, I make a podcast that pays no attention to concision and is very heavy on extensive research. And so it's obviously a bit of a judgment call if I'm going to talk for like 50 minutes to decide what to include and, more importantly, what to exclude. And I mostly kind of wanted to use this time less to convey in any substantive detail like a lot of the research that I've been doing or the things that I've tried to communicate on the podcast per se, but to selectively amplify a small subset of some of the scientific findings, but in particular kind of like a wholesale change in a scientific paradigm, a wholesale change within how evolution is thought about and how scientists are talking about kind of like what life fundamentally is, and to try to convince you that this has applications that are pretty interesting and pretty directly pertinent to this experience we're all having of watching the world come undone together and feeling mostly like spectators, right? And I guess I would ask like, yeah, okay, so maybe just to elicit a little bit of participation, will folks raise their hand if they're familiar with this experience of like whatever if somebody stopped you on the street and asked you in a given moment, like, are things going to be okay? Is everybody going to die? Is this the end of all complex life on Earth? Or whatever, like, raise your hand if you have the experience of kind of like waking up in the morning at 9 a.m. and being like, everything's hopeless. It's going to be terrible to watch the end of life on Earth. And then it's like 11 and you made coffee and you're like, I'm going to fight with everything I have to the very end. And then you get like a fucked up text message at 1 p.m. and you're like, no, actually everything is hopeless. You know what I mean? Like that rapid cycling through like, really, do people know what I'm talking about? Yeah. And so obviously like your reasoning processes feel really inviolate in those moments. It doesn't feel like you've changed your mind because you had a cup of coffee or got a text message. Like we have this really strong tendency when we've come to a conclusion to be practically certain that we reasoned our way to it with this really, really ironclad logic, and that, we like it or not, we've found our way to the one definitive truth. But whatever feels like the truth at any given moment happens to be a function of the details of our embodiment, the state of being that we're inhabiting at any given point structures our reasoning. And so I guess like what I want to make a case for is that if you're somebody like me who has spent a lot of time earnestly, agonizing over and maybe even trying to intervene in this trajectory we're on and finding that it hasn't exactly gone great or anything, that, or maybe like it's gone really, really, really bad and it leaves you with this like really desperate sinking pit of despair in your stomach that, gives you kind of this sense that there's just something really like fundamentally wrong with people, and that what we're witnessing is just like an inviolate function, therefore, of like how people are. What I want to make the case to you about is that on some really fundamental level reflects the very idiosyncratic, very evolutionarily recent embodied state that you and I are inhabiting as a function of being in this civilization and interacting with all of these systems that take us so far away from the embodied world and any like sort of sense of continuity with life itself, and also the embodied state that comes from subjugation, from chronic subordination in the dominance hierarchy that we inhabit. Species, ranging from fish to birds, all exhibit these characteristic behavioral changes when they're being subordinated and they just can't escape that situation. And it involves a lot of the same sort of like the broad like affect that I would say I'm witnessing kind of take over cities all over the West Coast. Yeah, in any case, I don't really travel farther than that, but that kind of like very like shut down, checked out, spaced out, like far away, just sort of like disconnected, sort of frozen affect. You know, that what we think we know about the destruction of the world and our potential agency in this process we're witnessing is heavily, heavily informed by the details of our embodiment from inhabiting this civilization. And that it is really, what I want to ask you is not to hope in the sense of some like principled embrace of an emotional state for its own sake, but I would like to ask that you are willing to be alive to the possibilities that there may be unexamined realities or variables that are heavily influencing the situation we're in that just really haven't come to the fore and been talked about, looked at, and kind of like integrated into anything like, like a coherent sort of responsiveness to the world as we find it today. And so the kind of like first of these sort of paradigm shifts that I want to acknowledge in evolutionary biology, which I hope would maybe give us some sense of more direct connection or participation, because I feel like it's so characteristic of living in this civilization that we kind of think of our thoughts or our desires or our like whatever our rationality and our benevolence as somehow like disconnected or out here and discontinuous from this world where these trees are growing and this blood is flowing through our bodies and this stage is right here. And we tend to look at life or evolution or the physical world or nature or whatever as something that's happening that we're kind of like looking down on from our view from nowhere, from our disembodied rational state. And more and more, a fundamental question about what life even is starting to be really asked by a lot of evolutionary scientists, which is interesting because if you ever like took an introductory bio course at any point, you might remember that at the beginning they do this really frustrating thing where they're like, what is life? Who knows? And then they just kind of move on, right? It's like they give you this checklist of traits that they're like, well, you know, we know that life is self-replicating and involves complex chemical reactions that happen in water or whatever. But, you know, the old scientific paradigm seemed like really singularly unconcerned with understanding what phenomena under study actually truly are. And it's very characteristic of like a wide number of disciplines. And recently this question has resurfaced more and more in this kind of new, more integrative, I guess you could say, paradigm that's happening within science in general, but in biology in particular. So I actually will ask if anybody can, and having listened to the podcast and knowing what I'm going to say isn't cheating if you have, but can anybody give a concise definition of life? Let me add a feature to what I'm really asking when I ask this question, which is because it's also so characteristic of this old kind of reductive paradigm in science to want to extricate our own perceptions from questions about what reality is as much as possible. And so all of those kind of like checklist approaches to what life is, none of that has anything to do with what we are intuitively responding to when, as children, we're able to distinguish living from non-living phenomena, right? So even though life takes this massive diversity of forms, even though it's ferns and it's red cedar trees and it's some guy making a fool of himself on a stage and it's you and it's, you know, it's all of us, when we're very, very young, we can begin to distinguish from, you know, living from non-living entities. And I'm pretty sure, and some scientists are starting to acknowledge this, that what we're ultimately seeing and responding to is self-directed motion, like a self-willed behavior that exists in contravention to the external forces that are acting upon it. So you know I'm alive because I'm standing here and I can do stuff like this and I can walk around like this. Whereas if I was just surrendering to gravity, right, it would be like this. And you likewise know that a red cedar tree is alive for the exact same reason, because if it was just surrendering to gravity, it would just be on the ground, but it's rising up to the sun, right? And you know that a fish is alive because it's swimming against the current. Life started on Earth almost exactly when conditions became theoretically habitable. So that also tells us something very interesting. We often hear this emphasis in this other slowly dying scientific paradigm on massive randomness. It's just like, okay, matter is this meaningless aggregation of dead substances, and for absolutely no reason whatsoever, some just like inconceivably improbable configuration of events happened where self-replication started, and then these self-replicators, and that's probably like really not actually what's happening. It probably tells us something very fundamental, not just about life, but about the world that life is an expression of. It probably really tells us something about the nature of reality, that life and consciousness and all of these other complex phenomena came into existence. And so what I kind of like ultimately want to communicate is this sense that your will is life, that your ability to look at how the world is and to want to assert some fundamental truth into it, or to to affect a deviation from the suicidal course we're on, is the most lifelike thing that you could possibly do. And this sense that we have that we're spectators and we're watching life unfold, or some inevitable aspect, some inextricable expression of human nature come to its catastrophic conclusion, that you're not a participant, or that you're not an observer, that you are a participant, and that desire to affect outcomes is nature. It is life, and there really is a meaningful conversation to be had. We mostly only hear this in the vaguest New Age rhetoric, but there really is a conversation to be had about us conceiving of preserving life on Earth as shifting the course of evolution, as directly participating in the dynamics of evolution. And so that's another thing that this new, more integrative paradigm in evolutionary biology has been slowly acknowledging, is that evolution is always happening. Everything that we do has some effect on our status as an organism, and whether, even if you personally don't have descendants, anything you do that affects other people and their status as entities. So again, to contrast with the old dying to dead reductive biological paradigm, where the only way that anything could ever change, behaviors, whether individual behaviors or wholesale social systems, were always thought of as kind of directly caused by genetic profiles. And the behavior flowed unidirectionally from gene sequences. There is more and more of an acknowledgement that what organisms actually do in their lifetimes is how evolution occurs, and genes essentially accommodate these changes. And so a lot of the first biologists who started really pushing back on that old way of seeing were biologists who studied species that had what are called alternate phenotypes. So the most well-known, the most commonly, popularly understood examples of these are within social insects. You have bees and ants and stuff like that have the workers and the queens and the soldiers. And these are massively behaviorally, physiologically, and anatomically differentiated entities, but they all start out with the same set of genes, right? And that's not what causes these radical changes. And so people, but this is like a really widespread phenomenon. It happens in vertebrates. One could perhaps argue that the complexity of civilization is creating something a lot like that in humans. But people kind of started to observe this and think like, well, okay, if we're seeing these radical shifts in what an organism can be in the course of a single generation, then why really would it be, if that plasticity exists within development, then why really would it be the case that most or all evolutionary change would occur through these like random, like slow, epochal accumulations of genetic copying error? And that obviously introduces like a very different set of things to think about. If what we do right here and now is reconfiguring us at the biological level, and those changes are going to propagate outward either through your own descendants or just in the ways you impact other people, it starts to feel a lot more, I don't know, kind of like exciting to be alive, right? There's all of this research that kind of acknowledges this is on a case-by-case basis. Like, turns out learning to juggle changes your brain structure. And oh, but so does learning to read. Oh, and so does driving a cab. And actually, the longer you drive a cab, the more the volume of your hippocampus changes. And these are all kind of presented as if they're like surprising results, as if they say something kind of like unique or particularly interesting about the particular task at hand that caused the biological change, or that it's like saying something really surprising about the brain that we haven't figured out yet. But all learning changes the brain. All experience changes the brain. And likewise, a huge number of studies report similar findings outside of the realms of brain structure and brain activity related to stuff like hormone profiles, right? Like, turns out your socioeconomic status fundamentally reconfigures your cortisol levels and things like that. So, obviously, whatever we do at any given moment changes us in some really fundamental way at a scale that I think, there's just no sharp line to draw between change we might call evolutionary and change we would just call like within the bounds of like individual development in a lifetime or whatever. But I think that it's actually really, really getting more and more plausible to say that we can affect evolutionary change within ourselves in the course of a lifetime. And you see this question emerge then about like, well, okay, so, what is it about humanity, the human experience, whatever, that has put us on this path that we're on? Why is it that over the course of the last, say, 5,000 years or so, humanity has come to be increasingly confined to exactly one kind of social system? We know that we're capable of a great diversity of experiences and behaviors, but there is this very monolithic trend towards people living in resource extraction-based hierarchical mass societies. And they don't work. They have a very, very long, like robustly documented history of collapsing after not very much time. And so, like what does looking at the human organism through this lens of rapid, radically adaptive evolutionary change, what does it give us or tell us about that fact, about this trajectory that we're increasingly confined to? And, again, I have to make a lot of decisions about what to exclude and what to include here. And I don't really think that I have time to totally do justice to the basis of this observation. But I will try to at least give some tentative sense of the foundations of my thinking this, which is that increasingly, like looking at the processes of state formation that have occurred around the world, where they've occurred and the struggles that have always been occurring against, the counter forces that have always been being exerted by significant numbers of people against these processes of domination and consolidation of power and this tendency towards resource extractive hierarchies. I've been increasingly focused on the sense that there's a kind of specialization that is occurring in complex mass societies that has a lot to do with the sort of temperamental range that people inhabit, where we sort of self-select into sets of experiences and social roles that have the kind of biological consequences I was just describing that change who we fundamentally are. And they leave us not only we obviously gain competencies and specializations and experiences whenever we do anything, whenever we play a show or work a line cooking gig or fall in love and write a poem or whatever. But the point being that we end up also allowing, in hyper-complex societies, we allow certain evolved behavioral capacities to atrophy. They go away because we're only engaged, because the nature of the civilization we inhabit allows for a very limited range of behavioral competencies to be exercised, right? You can get away with not doing most of the things that everybody did in any kind of ancestral society. And that ends up creating, basically social and technological complexity of the kind that's characteristic of this civilization amplifies a certain set of individual differences. And the kinds of people who end up having experiences where they go out into the forest and they think, wow, everything seems really fundamentally interconnected, and it's kind of a tragedy that we're destroying it all. Those kinds of people don't typically end up self-selecting into the developmental trajectories, the social role specializations, whatever you want to say, that give them much access to power as it's exercised in the situation. In fact, it's kind of like if you want to look at a war between, well, I use the term war to refer to the social struggles that maybe that's a little excessive, but if you want to look at a conflict between, say, some people who want to blow the top off a mountain to mine the coal underneath and some people who think that's a really bad idea, you're not just looking at a conflict between people who have different perceptions of the world. You're looking at a conflict between people, some of whom have specialized in violence and engineering, and some of whom have specialized in things like writing songs and, self-expression. And a lot of these conflicts actually end up looking bizarrely like conflicts between people who are really good at some form of symbolic expression or self-expression or some mode of cultural production in a fight with people who are really good at manipulating physical reality. And after 30 years of having those kind of fights, I've gotten really sick of it. And I've started to really feel like, doing this stuff that I've done for as long as I have really watched the sort of collective temperament change a lot. In my youth, I felt like I was constantly surrounded by people who were like, yo, global anarchist ecological revolution is imminent. And I was like, maybe not though, And now I feel like I'm almost never around anybody who really has much of any hope at all, really. And you can see the ways that people kind of toe the line, but then there's also all of these behaviors that tend to kind of strongly suggest that people are pretty fundamentally giving up. And I've really come to inhabit this sense of I don't know, I feel like I'm carrying this burden. And I don't know if I am doing a good job of articulating at all what the burden is, but it's something that emerges from having had the experiences of a few decades of ecological political conflict and reading everything I've read, where I really feel like the sense of hopelessness that is taking people over, while I certainly share, like, while I am no stranger to despair and grief, I really have this distinct sense that that response really is a little too rigid, that it really is like a trauma response in some sense, and that there really actually are a lot of very interesting unexplored possibilities that just haven't been meaningfully engaged with in the kinds of movements and the kinds of like political tendencies and whatnot that have ever gained any kind of like, sufficient prominence or prevalence to be like doing things in the world in any recognizable way. And a primary one of those is this sense that just like throughout, I'm sure, my own and I'm sure many of y'all's lives, there's been experiences that are kind of like these spontaneous paradigm shifts where, like I said, you go out to the forest and suddenly the world is reconfigured and, you realize that there's this direct continuity with all of existence that you hadn't quite comprehended before, or whatever the case may be. I'm almost sure that there's another set of experiences like that people like us could have that would have more to do with getting out of some of the confines that our unique temperaments in a feedback loop with this unique social complexity we inhabit have kind of made invisible to us, that would give us more of a sense of how power might really be exercised. And I don't have like a single definitive sort of like practice that I'm employing to that end, but I do find that life is a lot more interesting, and watching the tragedy that we're all watching unfold feels a lot less like a meaningless horror by just kind of like engaging that question very actively. The sense that evolution is happening right now. I contain one very distinct set of the overall possibilities that I was born with. Like, we are all manifesting a tiny, tiny proportion of the potentials that are latent within us at birth. And that there really might be other moments where, you're standing over here and everything looks one way, and then you kind of like shift out of that paradigm and you see a bunch of truths that weren't accessible to you in the old embodied state. And I just really wanted people to, like, the thing that I really did want people to take away from this is that sense, that thrilling sense that evolution is happening right now and that you're participating in it, and that there's no neutral territory. There is no default option for your existence. There's nowhere you can just be where nothing's happening. You're always embedded in this process. And it's pretty thrilling and interesting, and I think worthy of like a different kind of attention being brought to bear on this crisis that we're inhabiting together than I typically see people bringing to bear on this crisis. And I haven't been keeping track of the time, but that's mostly what I have to say. What time is it, Nathan?
It is, you got like at least, I think, 20 minutes.
Really?
1:32.
It's 1:32. Okay. What's in my notes? Are there any questions or anything like that? No, that's it. I did the whole thing.
What are some of like the potentialities of different social interactions maybe that you are thinking about in terms of movements towards avoiding the doom?
Yeah, I mean, something that I found was really characteristic. Yeah, the question was like, what in terms of social interactions I've been thinking about that like has this quality of trying to like shift our status or like shift our perceptions into something more productive. And so I like what I really experienced in my life of like movement organizing, like doing, like blockades and tree sits and all that kind of stuff, is that it really tended to bring out exactly one kind of, it amplified one temperament. That was a very like exploratory, sensation seeking, like saying, hey kids, like who wants to go live in the forest and stop people from logging, and like you can like live in a tree. That's not just a strategic argument, and that's not just like a moral argument. That's an advertisement for a way of being that's very like I said, like very exploratory and very sensation seeking. And I've like really been, a thing that's horrified me every time that I've had any kind of like contact within institutional politics, like shaking the hand of some policymaker or whatever, is realizing that there's just really no adults anywhere in this system, right? That like somehow or another, like the thing that you're experiencing of being like, God, do I really know how to be a parent or whatever? Like, so are the motherfuckers who design nuclear power plants. And like there just aren't any people who've really, it seems like there is something about our society that really prevents people from functionally accessing a state I would simply describe as adulthood. And there's a lot of the reason that the kind of politics, the kind of like resistance politics that so many of us have had experiences with seem to fail, is because there are so many people who are primarily attuned to a need for like a sense of stability or competence to come from anything that they're going to be politically responsive to. And so a lot of what I've been kind of like trying to do in this little group that I built out of the podcast that I make is exactly that, like to really just ask this question of like, well, if there's no room full of adults soberly deliberating about the problems that, the crisis that everybody can see we're in the midst of, what would it feel like to become that room full of adults? And that is very much, in addition to like a logistical question, is very much this sort of like crazy developmental, spiritual, temperamental, whatever. So that would be one form of the answer. Is like, I'm kind of tired of people being like, yo, that one time that we shut down those trains, like I never felt so alive. And it's like kind of like, that's good, but that's just like one very distinct subset of our overall experiential possibility. Yeah.
I might fumble around with this a little bit, so forgive me. But I guess I just wanted to ask if you had any thoughts on non-genetic evolution and human beings primarily. This is something that I think about quite often. Of like, if the genes haven't really changed very much in the past 40,000 years, we've introduced things like logic, destructive syllogisms,
right.
Shifting hierarchies, and that's I guess a bit more genetic than genetic at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally happening all the time, right? Like, the whole thing, I think a lot of people are familiar with the IQ test one, where like, generation after generation, the average scores on IQ tests are changing, and it doesn't reflect any genetic change. It actually reflects experience, not specifically with IQ tests, but like an accumulation of intergenerational experience with manipulating like abstract symbols on a two-dimensional surface, right? And you look at, there's that really famous paper, the like WEIRD paper, which stands for like Western Educated Industrialized, right? But it demonstrates all these like not just psychological differences between people in industrialized societies and more traditional ones, but like actual cognitive differences, like at the level of basic information processing. People being subject to optical illusions in one kind of society that they're not in another, and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I mean, that's definitely happening. Like that's kind of the essence of what I'm trying to get at, is like we don't really, like genes were focused on for so long, so monolithically, because people could imagine the means by which the inheritance occurred, and so they kind of wanted to reduce everything to that. More and more, like biology is really having this interesting time right now, where it's kind of like what happened in physics 100 years ago or so, where instead of everything getting more and more comprehensible, suddenly these results started happening where people were like, whoa, we live in a very mysterious world, and like we're actually starting to understand less. And biology is kind of having that with this question of like how information is really even like where all the information lives or how it's being transmitted. And, you know, so stuff is happening like scientists are training gene regulatory networks on some experience, and then without the network physically changing, it's behaving differently because it learned something. Stuff like that, where there's like no longer any genetic basis in like the way we talk about genes as these like sequences of nucleotides to like identify how organisms are learning and adapting. So we don't really know like exactly why we're changing ourselves and how it's being transmitted, but something's happening. And yeah, and like I said, you know, like literally every book you read, whatever, every experience we have is contributing to that in some sense or another.
Yeah, throughout my life, I've seen like certain things become like a big deal, like the Dakota Access Pipeline,
Yeah.
you know, the Demonster protests, like certain things create like this social explosion for like a small period of time, and then it kind of goes away. And I'm just wondering like what your thoughts are on like maybe why like like certain things are only because things like that happen all the time, but there are certain instances where it just gets everybody fired up, you know, and it's like why is that? Why did the momentum die? Why, you know, like
Yeah, I don't know. And I've talked about it a lot, and it's really frustrating. Yeah, like why the flashpoints are what they are and not some other, like, literally, like, completely separate set of flashpoints is, like, the great mystery of all political organizing. And I think that, like, the way people have kind of, like, historically grappled with that uncertainty is to be like, okay, we don't know when things are going to pop off, but let's, like, lay a foundation. Like, let's, like, build infrastructure and skills or whatever for when these moments of, like, ephemeral energy emerge. And then let's, like, really try to carry that, like, all the way past the finish line to, like, revolution or whatever. And I think that that's, like, a useful way to think about things to an extent. But I also just really think that that whole... What ends up happening because of that dynamic is that a lot of people who like really are willing to commit their lives to affecting social change just end up running around place to place like, oh, it's happening over here, like let's go over here, and we'll start like conducting workshops and getting people organized. And like and at some point, like kind of in the same vein as like the question about like social, you know, like building a more sort of like adult competence kind of like, I think there has to be like more of an institution building perspective that comes from somewhere, you know, and does something. And it's I don't know why, but we really are seeing, if anything, like a decline in that. Like if you look at how people did revolutionary politics like a century ago, there was like a lot more institution building. And it seems like there is, I mean, I think there's probably a lot of reasons for that. Like honestly, maybe people's reward circuitry and attention and everything is just like so fucked up that like, I don't know, you know. But also I do think that trying to build something carries the emotional risk of like hope, and it carries a certain vulnerability in a way that just like lighting dumpsters on fire when the cops shot somebody really doesn't, you know. And so I do think that's like a big part of that too. Joshua.
You described stepping out of the feedback loop that you think can kindle hopelessness.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious, like, you do the podcast, you're writing, are there other practices that you engage in that keep that inspiration going for you?
Like that is a good question, because I really am truly burdened by this sense of not feeling as glum as most people or something. And like I often wonder what in my life or in what I'm actively doing day to day, I don't know, like has that effect. My practice is very, yeah, I'm trying to build a group with my podcast listeners. And that has been interesting because I do think that something that I would say based on past organizing efforts is that we often create like very, very broad frames for participation in some kind of collective effort. And there's something sort of psychologically predictive about spending a bunch of time listening to me talk about the crazy stuff that I talk about that made me feel like it would be like a different room full of people to engage with. And so that's something that I think has like a lot of power, is that sense of like really asking in some like substantive detail, like, who do you want to be trying to work with? Like on more, is it 5 minutes?
It is 5, but our next speaker is not here, so please feel free to take whatever time you like, and we'll give you a signal when we shut up.
But yeah, like asking about who you want to be working with in what ways, and then trying to create some kind of like more complicated process than like, hey, who wants to come to the meeting about stopping climate change or whatever, to kind of like engage and cultivate like a like very specific kind of affinity between very specific kinds of people. I wouldn't say that the process of doing like what I've been doing is like has automatically equated to, you know, like clear, like decisive revolutionary potential or anything, but it does feel very different than anything I've experienced in the past. It's like I just could not go to like another, you know, like Earth First meeting or whatever. It would just feel too much like a repetition of things that have already failed. And this does feel different. And I think like that fact of like just engaging with something that feels novel is like really, really helpful. But then that sense of like just wanting to have sort of like novel experiences, like I think informs a really sort of broad exploration in my life, where I'm kind of always reflecting on the big like paradigm shifts or epiphanies that I've had, and how they just required like random configurations of inputs to like emerge. And just like trying to like, you know, just like literally walking around Portland with this kind of like hunger for some like state of being that I haven't experienced before, just to like see what it brings out, which you know goes how it goes. Yeah.
Thinking about like a clip that I saw of Terrence McKenna like predicting meme culture like 20 or 30 years ago. I don't know if you've seen that or if anyone else has seen that, but I haven't really like heard him much, and I still haven't. But I saw that like 3-minute clip, and it just makes you think about how like overexposed everybody is to like various things on the internet, like and social media, and like the encapsulation of like an idea into a meme was what he was talking about, and he talked about how like the encapsulation of an idea was going to, you know, like change consciousness as we get it, which ties to something that Paul A was talking about in the talk yesterday about like the enclosure, like internet enclosure, like onto like the humans making, and having like a brief experience working in an advertising agency and seeing that kind of culture, like that, you know, like a few decades of small groups of people doing things behind closed doors that the masses like have no idea like how their psyches are being manipulated. It just makes me think about how like now like a 24-year-old can like tweet something like, they defunded the arts so that no one could imagine a world beyond capitalism, and like that will go viral.
Right.
And I'll like take a screenshot of it and like, you know, put it in my like scrapbook or whatever. But the thing that you're talking about is like it's hard to see what's happening in like a body that's like having this linear experience, but like on a psychic level or on like a conscious
Yeah, and my experience, I mean, I do interact with like the kids these days a fair amount. And my experience of that, of like meme culture, like encapsulating really complex political ideas or whatever, like really concisely and effectively, is that I interact with all these kids who've learned like this whole wilderness of political terminology and stuff by the time they're like 16. Like they're really sophisticated in this way, but they're also really behaviorally paralyzed. Like they're like amazing, it's like kind of really heartening, but there's definitely this very missing element from that sophistication being like useful, like yeah. But it is amazing. I mean, stuff that I used to have to like walk around and talk with my friends about for like days and like read multiple zines and, heavy, like dense theoretical books. It's like these kids do just pick up from like a meme, literally.
They tweet it, and then like 30 years older, like,
Yeah.
what did I ever think?
Yeah, totally. Okay, cool. I think. Is there another speaker still? Is that just not?
No, I think Kyle has not showed up.
Oh, okay. It's
So,
just.
like, I think the deal is that like we're just gonna leave you on stage, and you're allowed to step down anytime.
TR.
Dave, if you had one thing for everyone to take away with them today, what would that be?
Well, it would be like a different kind of attention to daily experience.